at the time of the prosecution, you were the deputy.
Thank you.
At the time of the prosecution, you were Deputy Chief, Criminal Division, U.S. Attorney's Office. Kind of give us a brief description of your responsibilities and duties in that position.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. I think there's some misnomer to the term Deputy Criminal Chief, and it's caused a fair amount of confusion. What my role was largely to do back in 2008 and 2009 until I became U.S. Attorney was to handle and oversee the guns and drugs prosecutions being done on behalf of the Northern District of Iowa. That meant that I generally mentored and supervised the drug attorneys in Cedar Rapids and those attorneys who were handling the violent crime cases. I was not the criminal chief, I was not the FAUSA, and I was not the U.S. attorney. Each one of those individuals were above me in the chain of command. At the time of the Postville operation, I was overseeing the supervision of law students, legal assistants, paralegals, SOUSs, and criminal attorneys, all of whom were involved in drugs and gun prosecutions.
Okay. Number two, what was your specific role in the Postville case?
I was involved over a 2-week period when the operation was in Waterloo, Iowa. My job was to serve as a liaison between my office, the defense attorneys, the court, the probation office, the clerk's office, the marshals, and the agents involved. That generally meant that I spent a lot of time on the phone. I had 3 phones at the time. I got my records back on just one of those phones. I had 687 calls in a 12-day window, and the other 2 phones rang about as often. So I spent 24 hours a day on site for the first 2 days. I was there all but maybe 4 hours to sleep on the 3rd day. And during that time, I was literally running around ensuring that the hearings were covered, that the defense attorneys had the materials they needed, that they had access to their clients, that the probation office got what they needed, that our office was getting things moving through as soon as possible. And so my role was really as a key problem solver during that raid.
Okay. What involvement did you have with the planning of the raid?
None.
What involvement did you have with the pre-raid ratified plea agreements?
None.
What role did you have with the prosecution of the cases?
To the extent it was going on when I was in Waterloo, I was there to make sure there were attorneys covering those hearings. We had 4 SOUSs brought in to assist with that. In the middle of one of the operations, I think we were in the middle of initial appearances, the chief judge became upset with 2 of the SOUSs, didn't like how they were handling cases, asked that I be paged and come down and take over them myself. I immediately went to the courtroom, which was the ballroom of this facility, and I stayed throughout the rest of those hearings to ensure things were going smoothly. So to the extent that's part of the prosecution, I was involved in that way. After May 23rd, which was when we left Waterloo, I wasn't involved again in the prosecutions.
Who had ultimate decision-making authority within your office?
Within my office, the U.S. Attorney at the time was Matt Dummermuth. I know much of this, and I don't know all the details because I wasn't involved in the planning, but much of the approvals were being done at the Department of Justice level, and I don't know all of the people involved in those decisions.
Okay, then I think you touched on this next question. What was the nature of Maine Justice's involvement with various stages of the Postville raid and criminal cases?
It's my understanding, and again I wasn't involved, that the planning took place from the fall of 2007 until the operation began in May of 2008. I know there was daily and regular contact during parts of that time. Certainly the major decisions about what charges to offer, what kinds of provisions were going to go into those plea agreements, I understand, were made with Department of Justice's either at their direction or with their blessing. This was an approved fast-track program, and as such, it had to have the endorsement of the Department of Justice.
Okay, number 6, what was the specific crime the government charged the workers with?
There were a handful, but the most predominant one was use of somebody else's Social Security card or use of somebody else's alien registration number.
7, what was the specific crime in the pre-ratified plea deal offered by the government?
It was those. There was, in fact, a matrix set up as part of the fast-track approved plea agreement where if certain facts were present, the plea offer would be X. If a different set of facts were present, the plea offer would be Y. There was very little, in fact, no that I'm aware of, movement off of what had been pre-approved other than to apply whatever the facts were to the particular plea agreement that fit that situation.
Number 8, reports indicate that almost 400 individuals who were in the United States unlawfully were charged with crimes. Reports also seem to indicate that about 300 of them pled guilty. A, can you please tell us what legal process those who did not plead guilty underwent?
There were a number of workers who were encountered at the site of agri-processors who were released on humanitarian grounds. Any worker who identified that they were caring for minor children when they were encountered at agri-processors, if there was only one person, in other words, if we found a couple, one of the parents went off for further processing, one parent was turned loose to go home and care for the children. Those were put into ICE custody, and I don't know all of the arrangements that happened with them. Those folks were not ultimately prosecuted by us. 306 were prosecuted through the operation in Waterloo. We had a number of people who made it to the operation site in Waterloo and then for the first time told us, okay, I really do have children. Those were immediately then released to go back home to care for those children. And then we had a handful of defendants who had initially identified themselves as adults, whose paperwork with the company indicated they were adults, but during the course of the 3 days we were in Waterloo, advised that they were in fact minors. We immediately, and I personally, immediately went to the judge and had those particular people, the cases against them dismissed, and they were moved into juvenile custody through ICE. Beyond that, I don't know what arrangements were made.
B, on 8 was, what was the conclusion of those who pled not guilty?
We had initial not guilty pleas, but all 306 who we charged during those days did plead guilty. There was not a single trial held.
Okay, 9, what was the which government agency was responsible for the treatment and care of the accused following the raid?
A handful of them, ICE predominantly, but certainly those who came into U.S. Marshal custody, it would have been U.S. Marshal responsibility.
Okay. And 10 and final, have you personally seen the accommodations? How would you describe them? Were they comparable to conditions found in Iowa detention facilities?
I did personally see them. As I said, I was on site 24 hours a day for the first 2 days and then nearly 24 hours that third day. The restrooms that all of us had to use were in the facility where the defendants were being housed, and so I was in and out of that building over those 72 hours. Every person I saw had a cot, they had a blanket, they had clean clothing, they had meals catered by Hy-Vee, which is a grocery store chain in Iowa. They had televisions, they had games. I never saw them playing the games, but they were sitting there. And so I don't know what all the conditions are at the prisons. I would guess there was more limited access to things like showers and things that were easier to provide in the jail setting. But during the 48 to 72 hours they were held in Waterloo, accommodations were everything you would and should expect. People were moved as soon as we could move them out of sight in Waterloo and into the real or more permanent detention facilities, and I have every reason to believe they were treated well throughout the time they were in our custody.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. Senator Harkin has asked that I submit this on his behalf. It is a letter of support for Ms. Rose to Senator Harkin from a group of defense attorneys involved in the case that Senator Grassley just discussed with you. And it was submitted during Ms. Rose's confirmation as U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Iowa, and so without objection I'll include this in the record.